All right, I am so excited to be here. Thank you everyone for holding space for me and for listening to this talk. Before I get started, I want to tell you a little bit about me, and because this talk might be a little bit different than what you're used to seeing at tech conferences. And I wanted to share with you a little bit about me through the careers that I've held. So first and foremost, in my teens and 20s, I wanted to be a journalist. There was nothing more fascinating to me than a career where you could both write a story about sewer grates and about Watergate and have them have just as much impact as one another. And that there was a moral aspect to it, that being a journalist, you could take a white nationalist and humanize him, or take a 12-year-old black boy and villainize him. But unfortunately, even though I love journalism, I graduated in 2018 into the American recession. It was a weird time for journalism because it was becoming what we called the death of print. There were microblogging sites popping up, one of which was called twitter.com. I don't know if you might have heard of it. But at that time, graduating into the recession, I held a degree in environmental science and math. So really, my career prospects were very narrow. So I tapped into a skill that I gained when I was 10. I started designing when I was 10 because my parents owned what was called a pre-press business. And many of you might not understand what this is, but it's basically a company where they took designs, took large format photographs of them, and then burnt them onto metal plates, and then they shipped those off to the printers. Within a matter of a year, that entire industry that they had these specialized skills in became completely obsolete with the advent of desktop publishing tools. So my dad had to go back to school full-time, which meant that my mom had to make up for the lost income, and they couldn't afford to send me to daycare, so I had to go to school with my dad. So as a 10-year-old, I sat in the back of a classroom on an iMac and learned programs like Corel Draw, destructive Photoshop before layers, which is terrifying, and Publisher. And these are all tools that I love to threaten React developers that are the new tools that will make their jobs obsolete. But learning all those skills, when I graduated into the recession, I realized that I needed to find ways to make money, so I hustled. I emailed everyone I knew and said, what design work can I do for you? That left me to creating everything from single origin coffee websites to pamphlets for belly dancers to postmodern jazz print work. And I spent the next few years building a studio. We had 5 team members across the world. Eventually, I joined an agency where I built a team of 2 designers to 26 interdisciplinary designers, developers, content strategists, and writers. And I worked on national accounts like Nike and Taco Bell. And that all sounds great on paper, but I was extraordinarily burnt out. I was working 60, 70-hour weeks, and I really didn't know what it was that I was doing anymore, or why I was doing it. So I did what any rational person would do, and I did a hard reset on my life. So I quit my job, my relationship, put everything in storage, and bought a one-way ticket to the Azores, which is a small grouping of islands outside of Portugal, to figure out what it was that I cared about. And in that reflection of 3 months traveling on my own, I realized that what I missed about design was my purpose, my why. And so in that, I realized that we needed to have a meaning for what we do, or else we will burn ourselves out. And when I look back on my career, I realized that journalism taught me to seek out stories that weren't being told from people who weren't being heard. Design taught me that our solutions are only as good as our framing of the problems. And activism taught me that unless we explicitly search for justice for all, we will only ever end up with justice for some. So my purpose is to seek solutions for justice. So last week, I was working on a product design project for a small startup, and I needed a series of faces for a contact grid, a familiar problem many of you might experience. I was using Framer X, and I found this plugin called Tiny Faces. And as I was adding faces, I realized that all of the faces were men. and I didn't understand why that was. When I dug in a bit, I realized that there was a toggle, which you can see activating here. And true is associated with men, and false is associated with women. So what that said to me was male means truth, and female means false. And suddenly, years of having men telling me that what I was saying was wrong made sense. But that's not all it said to me. It also made me ask the question, well, what happens with non-binary users? That they're non-existent. This isn't an uncommon pattern. You'll see this everywhere. If you've ever filled out a form that asks for your gender, more likely than not, male will come first and female will come second. Non-binary is rarely represented. Sometimes you have do not disclose or other. So I want today to ask, how did we get here? How do we fix this? And then how do we prevent it from happening in the future? So hello, my name is Tatiana Mac, and I'm here to talk to you about how to build socially inclusive design systems. So the first thing about design systems, and the first trait that makes a successful design system, is to make it component-based. And what that means is to take each element and reduce it down to the smallest replicable unit. So in our instance here, a gender selector, that's a drop-down. Drop-downs get fed into form patterns, which then get fed into larger sites like a product registration. And if we follow Brad Frost's model of atomic design, then our drop-down is the atom, the form is the molecule, and the product registration is the organism. And what is so powerful about design systems is that they're scalable. So we not only can use this pattern for product registration, we can also use them for sign-up forms. But what happens when we have a drop-down that goes into a form pattern and a product registration that's exclusionary, as we saw the drop-down was earlier? Well, what happens is our exclusionary atom gets fed into an exclusionary molecule, which then gets fed into an exclusionary organism. And I wish it would just stop there, but those exclusionary organisms then get fed into exclusionary beings or products, and then they get fed into the exclusionary ecosystem, which is the tech industry. So the way that this came about with that particular Framer X plugin is that they were pulling in from the Facebook API. So I looked at the Facebook API, and this is what it pulls in. It says, gender is selected by the person, male or female. If the gender is set to a custom value, this value will be based off of the preferred pronoun. It will be omitted if the preferred pronoun is neutral. So it's a lot to unpack. Documentation is not usually written in human language, so I unpacked it for us. What that says is if the person selected male on Facebook, then they will have a male value. Makes sense. The person selected female, they will have a female value. Also makes sense. If the person is non-binary, then they have a list of custom choices. So our favorite phrase, it depends. So if we look at these custom choices, if the person uses he, him pronouns, then it'll pass them as male. If they use she, her pronouns, then they will pass them as female. But if they use any of the other pronouns listed, that will render as null. So cue internal scream, because you can already see there's a logical flaw in the way this API is being written. And gender is not equivalent to gender pronouns. So if we look back at this API is not only being used for tiny faces for Framer X, it's being used for so many things. The Facebook API is so commonly tapped into. So what happens here is that we have an exclusionary ecosystem. The Facebook API is sustaining some bad practices and defining the systemic issues. But then the atoms that we're using, the dropdown, is introducing this bad pattern and feeding back into the system. That's what we call a positive feedback loop. So when I tweeted about this, some of the responses I got were really lovely. This person said, "This is a bug, just report it. I'm sure they'll be thankful as it's missed their QA." This other person said, "Given that they've used in true or false for type, it just seems like lazy dev work more than anything." Those things might be true, but I want us to remember that intent does not erase impact. And to unpack this phrase, intent focuses on the designer. Impact focuses on the user. I'd love for us to borrow from this old design adage of form follows function. What if intent could follow impact? What if we took the designer intent and drove it by the user impact? By centering the user this way and centering each of our individual atoms, we are looking at the smallest components of our designs and of our users. These are the smallest individual units we can have. So if we find a way to take the intent of our atoms and match them to the impact we'll have on our users, that's what provides us with meaningful access. And that's what makes our system accessible. So once we've mapped that our component-based design system is accessible, the next trait that makes a successful design system is that it's comprehensive. So comprehensive means that all atoms are present. And common types of atoms within a design system can reflect type, color, spacing, imagery, motion, video, voice, and tone. And if we look at the smallest components again, we also need to look at what comprehensive means for the user. So we need to make sure all users are present. When we're looking at creating our tools, we often cast an arbitrary net around our users. We create a group. We have to do that because we have to limit resources or whatnot. But what inevitably happens as a result is that there are users that are outside of the scope of our group. And so a question that we can do to prevent this from the lovely inclusive design lead at Airbnb, Benjamin Evans, is he always has his team ask, who are we missing? And it's a bit of a futile question because we're always missing somebody. And the impact of that is that we're telling the people that we're missing that there's no place for them here. There's no place for them to use our products. So the impact we have is exclusion. And it's, of course, unintentional. You hear that all the time. Well, I didn't mean to make that exclusionary. Sure, but that doesn't change the impact you had. So again, looking back at our smallest individual components, it's not just that we're mapping users to atoms, we're actually mapping users to designers and to developers. That's the human side of this. So when we look at whether all users are present, we need to remember that in order to create things for people, they need to be creating them as well. There's a saying in accessibility that says nothing about us without us. Well, but when we look at tech, we have a conundrum here. 83% of tech executives are white, and men outnumber women 4-to-1 in STEM. So now it starts to add color to why maybe that drop down was male first, then female. And the reason for that is something we all possess, which is an affinity bias. It's this idea when you prefer people that you share qualities with, someone that's relatable or familiar, like in Mean Girls. I have a little clip for you from Mean Girls. It'll work. Okay. Well, the clip won't work, but it's a scene from Mean Girls, which is a movie about a bunch of teenagers. Lindsay Lohan moves, and she's learning about the inner workings of this cliquey high school. And one of her friends runs her through the lunchroom and describes to her all of the different stereotypes. And that's the thing, is opinions are like, we know this phrase, everyone's got one, but it's actually that opinions are like biases. And bias is a 4-letter word. We really hate to admit our bias. So we often pretend like we don't have them. And this comes from this idea of wanting to feel like our designs and our products are empirical and objective. It's a similar problem in journalism. Journalistic objectivity is this idea that the writer should be fair, disinterested, and factual, and have no partisanship at all, and that they shouldn't ever be on any side of an argument. They need to report on facts and not personal attitude. But Hunter S. Thompson realized that that's a load of bunk. There's no way that we can remove our bias, no matter how hard we try, so he instead coined this idea of gonzo journalism. It's a style of journalism that was created without any claims of objectivity, and including the journalist as part of the narrative. So I hope that we're able to admit our biases and not be ashamed about it, because we all have them. So what about gonzo design? What if we were to take this idea that the designer is a part of the system that we create, and we're a part of the narrative that we're drafting? What if we showed the makeup of our teams within our design systems, and we're honest about the diversity reflected in them, or the lack of diversity? Because when we look at race, gender, orientation, ability, socioeconomic status, religion, philosophy, nationality, and language, those are only a few of the ways that we can categorize people. So when we look at whether all atoms are present, we need to make sure that we're reflecting all those characteristics. That's what leads us to inclusion. So once we realize that our components are accessible, our system is comprehensive, which means it's inclusive, we need to make sure that it's cooperative. When we look at all of these characteristics I listed out, we have to recognize that there's no way that our teams, especially when we have smaller teams, can reflect that entire spectrum of human existence. So we have something, though, that helps us with that, which is the feedback loop. We receive feedback all of the time, and we feed that feedback back into our designs. So we might have a customer service team that channels that feedback back to us as designers, and that creates a relationship. It connects the theory behind our designs with the reality of what they play out in the world. But it's not really that just our customer service teams, because they're a conduit and an important conduit, but it's that they are speaking on behalf of our users. So what we're doing is we're connecting the reality of our users' lives to the theory and connecting the impact we have on them with our intent. So when we look at this positive feedback loop, we have this component of research, but it's not their job to educate us on all of the things in the world. We need to do more, because if we only rely on that, we're only doing reactive research. We need to have proactive research to seek understanding about existences that are different than our own. And so what this does is it creates a system where we're perpetually auditing our design systems. So after I tweeted about the issue with tiny frames, which I got a lot of critique for the way that I tweeted it, which fair, Maxime de Greve, who is the creator, reached out and did everything he could to fix it. And I really appreciate the way that Maxime responded, and we're currently talking about how to work around that Facebook issue to fix it and to make his product better. And so he released an update, which isn't perfect, but it certainly is a step in the right direction. And why I appreciated this so much is that he just apologized for it and found a solution. And the mechanisms for these apologies are so important to learn. First, he just resisted the urge to center himself or to make any excuses. He apologized for the impact it had on me and to others. He made a plan to fix it, and said that he would remember this next time he was creating a product. So when we are able to make our system cooperative, it's most successful when it can be adaptable, when we can take in that new information from the feedback and put it back into our systems, because we're going to make mistakes. Design systems are supremely powerful for their scalability, and I think that's why so many of us care to create and establish and maintain these design systems. But there's an unfortunate inherent flaw that in its greatest strength also lies its greatest weakness. That a design system acts as the connective tissue that holds together your platform. So if you have a design system that's ableist, or sexist, transphobic, or racist, all of those things are going to be fed into the being of your entire platform. And when we look at this group that we cast of users that are in and users that are out, it's reflective of something greater. That the users that are always squarely within tend to be white, cisgendered, hetero males who are neurotypical and able-bodied. And the rest of us are outside of that. And the reason for this is because the overarching system that controls it all is the capitalist white supremacist patriarchy. That system is intrinsically and inherently racist, sexist, ableist, transphobic, and homophobic. And so when we're working so hard to make our components accessible and making our system comprehensive and inclusive and cooperative and adaptable, we're fighting against that system and what that system wants. What that system wants is for it to be inaccessible to all. It wants for it to be exclusive, and it wants for it to be extraordinarily rigid. So we need to understand the impact of this. We need to work to dismantle the connective tissue of this infrastructure within ourselves and within the systems that we build. So we have to resist relentlessly at the atomic level. If we create inclusionary atoms and we consider people at that level, that'll lead to inclusionary organisms and patterns, which will lead to inclusionary products and an inclusionary ecosystem. So when we take this graph of what's intrinsically centered and we instead flip it and we take people that are typically marginalized at the edges and we place them squarely within. If we were to center instead Black, trans, queer, neurodiverse, non-binary, disabled perspectives, we might not have ended up with the problem that Maxine and I dealt with earlier. Because when you look at this, you might be saying, well, doesn't that just cause the same problem? Well, no, because the rest of us, there are so many more of us. We will always make sure that our experiences will be accounted for. It's these experiences in the middle that are often marginalized and forgotten. And what if we're successful at this? Well, I think we'll find that that circle will be removed. So if we're able to do this, I think we can focus our energy elsewhere. Instead of just focusing on things being accessible, what if we can make sure our components were innovative? Instead of them just being comprehensive and inclusive, what if they were creative? And what if we weren't just focusing on making sure that our systems were cooperative and adaptable, that they were instead interdisciplinary? There's so much potential that we're missing out on because we're unable to solve this problem. So let's burn this shit down and build something better. And this time, we're going to move intentionally and fix things. Thank you.